The words hit me like a physical blow as I stood beside my father's mahogany casket. "Dad changed his will 2 months ago," my brother Derek announced to the gathered mourners, his voice carrying across the funeral home chapel. "Elena gets nothing. Everything goes to me." The room fell silent except for the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers. I felt 200 pairs of eyes turn toward me, watching for my reaction. My hands trembled as I clutched the eulogy I'd spent 3 sleepless nights writing, now meaningless paper in my shaking fingers. Derek stood on the other side of our father's casket wearing an expensive charcoal suit I'd never seen before, his expression somewhere between triumph and manufactured grief. He looked every inch the successful son, the worthy heir. I looked down at my own modest black dress, purchased on clearance specifically for this occasion, and felt the familiar sting of inadequacy my father had cultivated in me for 34 years. Then something unexpected happened. Malcolm Hendricks, my father's attorney for over 20 years, rose slowly from his seat in the 3rd row. His silver hair caught the soft lighting as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms. "I think," he said quietly but firmly, "we should discuss this matter privately. After the service." Derek's confident expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into smug certainty. But I saw it. That brief flash of something that looked almost like panic. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My name is Elena Vance, and the story of how I ended up at my father's funeral being publicly disinherited begins long before that gray November morning in Portland, Oregon. It begins in the shadow of a man who built an empire and crushed his daughter in the process. My father, Gerald Vance, was a self-made millionaire who started with nothing and built Vance Industrial Supply from a single warehouse into a regional powerhouse with contracts spanning 3 states. He was the kind of man business magazines profiled, the kind of success story people admired from a distance. The American dream personified. What those articles never mentioned was the cost of that success, paid in full by the people closest to him. Growing up in our sprawling home in Portland's West Hills, I learned early that love in the Vance household was conditional. My brother Derek, 4 years older than me, seemed to understand instinctively how to earn our father's approval. He played football in high school even though he hated it because Dad had played football. He studied business at the University of Oregon because Dad demanded it. He joined the family company immediately after graduation and became Dad's shadow, learning every aspect of the business with grim determination. I was different. I was the daughter who wanted to study literature instead of business, who preferred quiet afternoons in Powell's books to networking events at the country club. I was sensitive where Derek was calculating, creative where he was pragmatic, empathetic where he was ruthless. In my father's eyes, these weren't just differences. They were failures. "You're too soft for this world, Elena," became his constant refrain. "You'll never amount to anything if you don't toughen up." When I was 13, I won a statewide writing competition. My essay about homelessness in Portland had beaten out entries from students twice my age. I came home with the trophy, excited to share my achievement with my father. He barely looked up from the financial reports he was reviewing. "Writing doesn't pay the bills," he said dismissively. "When are you going to focus on something useful?" My mother, Patricia, tried to be the buffer between us. She would find me crying in my room after particularly brutal conversations with Dad and stroke my hair with gentle hands. "Your father just wants you to be prepared for the real world," she would say. "He grew up with nothing, Elena. He doesn't want you to struggle like he did." But even as a child, I could see the sadness in her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched when Dad raised his voice. She stayed for reasons I wouldn't fully understand until much later, and she tried to love me enough to compensate for his coldness. The pattern continued through high school and college. Every achievement I earned in areas Dad didn't value was met with indifference or criticism. Every misstep was proof of my inadequacy. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in English literature from Reed College, Dad didn't attend the ceremony. He was closing a business deal in Seattle. Derek was there, sitting beside our mother, but he spent most of the time on his phone, already deep into his role at Vance Industrial. After college, I did something that shocked everyone. I moved to Vietnam to teach English. For 2 years, I lived in Hanoi, as far from my father's influence as I could reasonably get. Those years were transformative. I discovered who I was without the constant weight of paternal disappointment. I made friends who valued me, students who looked up to me, and I started to believe that maybe I wasn't the failure my father had always claimed. Then came the phone call that brought me back. Mom had suffered a severe stroke. She was in the ICU at Oregon Health and Science University, and the prognosis wasn't good. I flew home immediately, leaving behind my life in Vietnam, my students, my independence. At 28, I moved back into my childhood home to help care for my mother as she slowly recovered enough to come home from the hospital. The recovery was brutal and incomplete. Mom lost mobility on her left side and struggled with speech. Physical therapy helped, but she would never be the same. During those long months of caregiving, my father was largely absent. The CEO of Vance Industrial was too busy expanding into new markets to spend much time with his invalid wife. Derek visited on Sundays, but he had his own life now, a wife named Brittany who worked in marketing, and a beautiful house in Lake Oswego. The bulk of Mom's care fell to me. I scheduled appointments with neurologists and physical therapists, managed medications, helped her relearn basic tasks, and sat with her through the long, frustrating hours when words wouldn't come and tears would. "You've always been my strongest girl," she managed to tell me one evening, her speech slurred but her meaning clear. "Don't let him make you think otherwise." She died on a Wednesday morning in March, 3 years after the stroke. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, her eyes meeting mine with what I chose to interpret as gratitude. At her funeral, I was emotionally shattered, having barely slept for weeks as her condition deteriorated. During the reception at our house, I accidentally spilled coffee on the antique Persian rug in the study. My father erupted in front of everyone. "Can't you do anything without making a mess?" he shouted, his face reddening with genuine rage. "Your mother spent 3 years as an invalid because you weren't watching her closely enough when she had the stroke. Now you're destroying everything she cared about." The accusation was as false as it was cruel. I hadn't even been in the country when Mom had her stroke. But the words landed with devastating precision. The room fell silent. Guests stared at their shoes. Derek stood near the doorway, his expression blank, neither defending me nor condemning our father's outburst. In that moment, something crystallized inside me. My mother was gone. The woman who had loved me despite my father's contempt, who had tried to shield me from his worst impulses, was no longer there to serve as a reason to maintain the pretense of family unity. Without a word, I walked upstairs, threw clothes into a suitcase, and left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't explain. I simply drove away from the house that had never truly been a home. With the small inheritance Mom had left me, $20,000 she'd kept in a separate account my father didn't control, I rented a tiny apartment in southeast Portland near Hawthorne. The neighborhood was nothing like the manicured streets of the West Hills. It was gritty, eclectic, alive with artists and musicians and people who existed outside the corporate world my father valued so much. I took a job as a barista at an independent coffee shop called Roasters Republic, serving lattes to students and freelancers while I figured out what came next. During my first month in that apartment, I met Harper Castellano at a community writing workshop held in a converted warehouse space. Harper was in her early 60s, a former journalist who had spent 20 years covering international conflicts before returning to Portland to teach and write. She had silver-streaked hair she wore in a long braid, laugh lines around her eyes, and an intensity that reminded me of everything I wanted to become. "You write like someone who's been hurt but hasn't let it destroy your empathy," she told me after reading one of my essays. "That's rare. Most people either shut down completely or turn their pain into weapons against others." Harper became my mentor in ways that went beyond writing. She introduced me to her network of independent publishers, editors, and journalists. She taught me that creative work wasn't frivolous or impractical but essential, that telling true stories was how we made sense of human experience. Under her guidance, I started writing in earnest. Essays about family dysfunction and caregiving, about the cost of ambition, about finding identity separate from parental expectation. I submitted to literary magazines and online publications, collecting rejections at first, then slowly, gradually, finding acceptances. My first published piece appeared in a small literary journal based in Seattle. It paid $50. I framed the check instead of cashing it. Over the next 6 years, I built a life that had nothing to do with my father or brother. I continued working at Roasters Republic, eventually becoming a shift supervisor. I published essays in increasingly prominent outlets. I made friends who valued creativity and authenticity over wealth and status. I dated occasionally, though nothing serious developed. I was healing, slowly learning to silence my father's voice in my head that insisted I was worthless. I heard updates about Derek and Dad through mutual acquaintances occasionally. The business continued to grow. Derek had become Chief Operating Officer, Dad's right hand in every decision. They were featured together in Portland Business Journal, photographed at charity galas and industry conferences. The perfect father-son business dynasty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt neither jealousy nor regret. That world had never wanted me, and I had discovered I didn't want it either. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in November, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Elena, this is Malcolm Hendricks. I'm calling about your father." The attorney's voice was professionally neutral but carried an undertone of something heavier. "He's had a massive heart attack. He's at OHSU. It doesn't look good." I stood in the back room of the coffee shop, surrounded by bags of beans and boxes of supplies, trying to process this information. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Derek is his emergency contact." There was a pause. "Derek asked me to inform you. He's with your father now." Malcolm hesitated. "Elena, if you want to see him, you should come soon." I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay away, to protect the peace I'd built over 6 years of distance. But something Harper had said during one of our many conversations echoed in my mind. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you create for yourself by showing up for the moments that matter, even when they're painful. I drove to the hospital through November rain, my windshield wipers beating a nervous rhythm. The ICU was on the 10th floor, all hushed voices and beeping machines and the antiseptic smell I remembered from my mother's illness. Derek met me in the waiting area, looking exhausted in expensive business casual clothes. For a moment, we just stared at each other, siblings who had become strangers. "He's sedated," Derek said without preamble. "Multiple organ failure. The doctors say it's a matter of hours, maybe a day." He studied my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Neither was I thought but didn't say. "Can I see him?" The man in the hospital bed barely resembled the Gerald Vance I remembered. 6 years had aged him dramatically, or perhaps I'd never really looked closely before. His face was gray, sunken, connected to a tangle of tubes and monitors. The hands that had built an empire lay motionless on the white sheets, for lines snaking into prominent veins. I stood beside the bed, uncertain what to feel. This was the man who had shaped my life through criticism and contempt, who had made me believe I was fundamentally flawed. Yet seeing him diminished like this, I felt only a hollow sadness for what had never been and now never would be. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said quietly, aware of Derek standing in the doorway behind me. "I don't know if it matters anymore. But I survived without your approval. I built a life you would probably despise, and I'm proud of it. I'm not the failure you always said I was." His eyes remained closed. The machines continued their steady beeping. If he heard me, he gave no sign. Gerald Vance died 3 hours later without regaining consciousness. I was in the hospital cafeteria drinking terrible coffee when Derek found me to deliver the news. His eyes were red, though I couldn't tell if from grief or exhaustion. "He's gone," Derek said simply, sinking into the chair across from me. For a long moment, we sat in silence, two people who shared DNA and history but little else. "The funeral will be Saturday," he said finally. Riverside Memorial Chapel. I'll handle the arrangements. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. It would mean a lot if you came. Whatever happened between you and Dad, he was still your father. Was he? I wanted to ask. Or was he just a biological fact, a man who shaped me through absence and criticism but never through love? The days between Dad's death and the funeral passed in a strange haze. I went through the motions at work, smiled at customers, made lattes, but my mind was elsewhere. Harper called me every evening, checking in, offering to accompany me to the funeral. You shouldn't have to face that alone, she insisted. But I declined. This was something I needed to do by myself, a final accounting with the past before I could fully move forward. I prepared a eulogy, sitting at my tiny kitchen table in my Hawthorne apartment, trying to find honest words that weren't cruel. How do you speak truthfully about a man who was respected publicly but terrible privately? I wrote and rewrote, searching for some truth that honored his accomplishments without pretending our relationship had been something it wasn't. What I came up with was careful, measured, a daughter's tribute that would satisfy public expectation while avoiding outright lies. Saturday arrived gray and drizzling, typical Pacific Northwest November weather. I dressed in my simple black dress, the only formal outfit I owned, and drove to Riverside Memorial Chapel in inner Southeast. The parking lot was already full when I arrived, a testament to my father's business prominence. I recognized many of the cars, Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas belonging to Portland's business elite. Inside, the chapel was filled with flower arrangements and hushed conversations. The casket was positioned at the front, surrounded by elaborate floral displays that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I saw Derek near the front, accepting condolences from a steady stream of suited executives and their perfectly dressed wives. He spotted me and made a small gesture toward the family seating area. I slid into the second row, behind where Derek and Brittany would sit, positioned in that liminal space that had always defined my place in the Vance family. Present but peripheral. The service began with conventional formality. A minister who had never met my father delivered generic platitudes about his business acumen and community contributions. Several business associates shared carefully crafted remembrances about deals closed and challenges overcome. No one mentioned what kind of father he had been, what kind of husband. The private man remained private even in death. When it came time for family remarks, Derek rose first. His eulogy was polished, professional, focused entirely on Dad's business legacy and work ethic. Gerald Vance taught me everything about building something from nothing, he said, his voice carrying across the silent chapel. He demanded excellence, accepted no excuses, and created opportunities for hundreds of employees across the Pacific Northwest. He was a titan of industry and an uncompromising leader. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium clutching my carefully prepared words, aware of curious eyes following my movement. Most of these people probably had no idea Gerald Vance even had a daughter. I began reading my eulogy, my voice steadier than I expected. I spoke about his determination, his business success, his rise from poverty to prosperity. I spoke about his complexity, the way public personas often differ from private realities. I was 3 paragraphs in when Derek interrupted me. Actually, he said, standing up from his seat in the front row, there's something important everyone should know. He walked toward the front, positioning himself beside Dad's casket in a way that commanded attention. The room fell silent, confused by this breach of funeral protocol. I stepped back from the podium, uncertain what was happening. Dad changed his will 2 months ago, Derek announced, his voice carrying clearly. Elena gets nothing. Everything goes to me. He pulled a folded document from his suit jacket pocket, holding it up like evidence. The house, the business, all assets, they're all mine. Dad wanted to ensure his legacy went to someone who understood its value, who had dedicated their life to continuing what he built. The chapel erupted in whispers. I stood frozen, my eulogy forgotten in my hand, processing this public humiliation. Of course Dad had cut me out. Why had I expected anything different? The man who had criticized every choice I'd made, who had dismissed my accomplishments and magnified my flaws, had delivered one final verdict on my worth. Nothing. I was worth nothing. But then Malcolm Hendricks rose from his seat in the third row. The veteran attorney moved with deliberate calm, his presence immediately commanding attention. "I think we should discuss this matter privately," he said, his tone professional but edged with steel. "After the service." Derek's expression flickered. "There's nothing to discuss. The will is clear." Malcolm adjusted his glasses, his gaze steady. "Nevertheless, there are legal complexities that should not be addressed in this setting. I suggest we reconvene in my office Monday morning. All interested parties should be present." The rest of the service passed in a blur. I went through the motions, shaking hands with strangers who offered condolences, accepting their sympathy while my mind raced with questions. What legal complexities? Why had Malcolm intervened? And why did Derek look less confident than he had moments before? At the reception following the burial, held at an upscale restaurant Dad had frequented, I kept to the periphery, avoiding Derek and the cluster of business associates congratulating him on his inheritance. I was preparing to leave when Malcolm approached, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered me one. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "But not here. Can you come to my office Monday morning? 9 o'clock? I nodded, too confused to formulate questions. Malcolm studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Your father was a complicated man, Elena. Monday, you'll understand just how complicated." That night, I sat in my apartment unable to sleep, replaying the funeral scene over and over. Derek's triumphant announcement. Malcolm's intervention. The whispers of the assembled mourners. I had spent 6 years building a life independent of my father's approval, yet here I was, still caught in the gravitational pull of his final judgment. I texted Harper, who called me immediately. "Whatever's in that will or isn't in it doesn't define your value," she said firmly when I explained what had happened. "You know that, right?" Intellectually, yes. Emotionally, the old wounds were fresh again. The message my father had sent was clear. Even in death, he wanted me to know I was worth nothing in his eyes. Sunday passed with agonizing slowness. I called in sick to work, unable to face cheerful customers and small talk. I tried to write, to process my feelings through words, but nothing came. I just sat, staring at my laptop screen, my father's final rejection echoing in my mind alongside every criticism, every dismissal, every moment of contempt I'd endured over 34 years. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. I dressed carefully, as if armor could protect against whatever revelation awaited. Malcolm's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel overlooking the Willamette River. His receptionist, a efficient-looking woman in her 50s, directed me to a conference room where Derek was already seated, Brittany beside him. My brother looked less confident than he had at the funeral. His expensive suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously on the polished conference table. Brittany offered me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. We waited in uncomfortable silence until Malcolm entered, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same wire-rimmed glasses. "Thank you both for coming," he said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "What I'm about to share is unusual, and I ask that you hear me out completely before reacting." He opened his briefcase and withdrew several documents, arranging them precisely on the table. "Derek, the will you referenced at the funeral is real. Your father did execute a revised will 2 months before his death, leaving virtually everything to you." Derek's expression shifted toward vindication. Malcolm held up a hand. "However, there is another document. One your father asked me to prepare at the same time." He slid a bound document across the table toward me. "Elena, your father created a trust. A substantial trust. And he made very specific provisions regarding its revelation and distribution." I stared at the document, afraid to touch it. Malcolm continued, his voice even and professional. "The trust contains assets valued at approximately $4.2 million. Cash, stocks, and several properties, including a commercial building in northwest Portland that generates significant rental income." The numbers made no sense. 4.2 million? My father, who had publicly disinherited me, had set aside millions in a trust. Why? I heard myself ask. Why would he do that? Malcolm removed his glasses, cleaning them methodically before responding. Because, Elena, your father knew exactly what he was doing to you. And on some level, he knew it was wrong. The conference room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with tension. Derek leaned forward, his jaw clenched. What are you talking about? Dad left everything to me. That's what the will says. Malcolm replaced his glasses with deliberate care. The will distributes the business, the primary residence, vehicles, and other tangible assets to you, Derek. That's accurate. However, over the past 15 years, your father systematically moved certain assets into a separate trust structure that exists outside the estate. These movements were legal, documented, and entirely intentional. He opened a folder and withdrew bank statements, property deeds, and investment records. It began shortly after Elena left for Vietnam. Your father opened accounts in her name, transferred funds quarterly, purchased properties through an LLC he created specifically for this purpose. He was meticulous about keeping these transactions separate from both his personal estate and the business accounts. I picked up the trust document with trembling hands, scanning pages of legal language that barely registered. I don't understand. He despised me. He told me I was worthless my entire life. Why would he give me anything? Malcolm's expression softened slightly. That's where this becomes complicated. Your father asked me to prepare a letter to be read to you after his death, in the event that you attended his funeral. He was very specific about the timing. He withdrew a sealed envelope from his briefcase, my name written across it in my father's distinctive handwriting. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. Dad wouldn't have hidden millions from me. We talked about everything related to the business and his assets. He was grooming me to take over. He was grooming you to run Vance Industrial, Malcolm corrected. But your father had assets beyond the company. Real estate investments, stock portfolios, bonds. The trust represents approximately 30% of his total wealth. The rest, including the business, goes to you as specified in the will. Brittany placed a hand on Derek's arm, her voice tight. Can he challenge this? The trust? Malcolm shook his head. The trust is ironclad. I drafted it myself, and your father had it reviewed by 2 other firms to ensure there were no vulnerabilities. Unless Elena chooses to disclaim the assets, which is her legal right, the trust provisions stand. I stared at the envelope with my name on it, afraid of what it might contain. My father had never written to me, not once in 34 years. No birthday cards, no letters during my time in Vietnam, nothing. Now, from beyond the grave, he had something to say. Can I read this alone? I asked quietly. Malcolm gestured toward a smaller office adjoining the conference room. Take your time. I'll explain the technical details to Derek. As I stood, Derek's voice stopped me. You're really going to take it? After abandoning the family for 6 years, you're just going to accept millions you didn't earn? The accusation stung, but I recognized the deflection. Derek was reeling from the discovery that our father had kept secrets from him, that the perfect father-son partnership had contained gaps he'd never suspected. I haven't decided anything, I said honestly. I don't even know what's in this letter. In the small office, I sat behind a desk cluttered with legal journals and case files, turning the envelope over in my hands. The seal was intact, the paper heavy and expensive. I slid my finger under the flap and withdrew several handwritten pages. My father's handwriting, usually bold and aggressive, was shaky here, written by a man facing his own mortality. The letter began without salutation. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you came to my funeral despite having every reason not to. That tells me something about your character that I failed to acknowledge while I was alive. I'm writing this 2 months after my first heart attack, the warning shot that my doctors tell me means I don't have much time left. I'm writing it because I need to explain something I could never say to your face. I paused, my hands trembling. The words continued. I was a terrible father to you, Elena. Not just inadequate or distant, but actively, deliberately terrible. I criticized you for being sensitive when sensitivity was evidence of empathy. I dismissed your talents because they didn't align with my narrow definition of success. I made you feel worthless because some broken part of me needed you to be small so I could feel large. Tears blurred my vision. I blinked them away, forcing myself to continue reading. The truth is, you terrified me. You were everything I'd trained myself not to be. Soft, creative, capable of genuine connection with people. After I escaped poverty, I built walls around myself made of ambition and control. Those walls protected me, but they also imprisoned me. You reminded me of what I'd sacrificed to build my empire, all the human connections and simple joys I'd dismissed as weaknesses. The letter detailed things I'd never known. How my father's own father had beaten him regularly, screaming that he was stupid and would never amount to anything. How he'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through community college, sleeping 4 hours a night, surviving on determination and rage. How he'd built Vance Industrial through sheer force of will, proving wrong every person who dismissed him as another poor kid with delusions of grandeur. When you were born, the letter continued, I was already well on my way to success. Derek was the heir I needed, the one who would carry forward everything I'd built. You were unexpected, unplanned. Your mother wanted you, so I accepted it. But from the beginning, I saw and knew the traits I'd spent my life trying to eliminate from myself. Your gentleness, your artistic temperament, your inability to harden yourself against the world. He described watching me as a child, seeing me cry over books, make friends easily, create art for the pure joy of creation. You had everything I'd lost, and instead of celebrating that, I tried to destroy it in you. I thought I was preparing you for a harsh world. Really, I was trying to make you as miserable as I'd made myself. The letter grew more difficult to read. When you left for Vietnam, I was furious. You were running away from your responsibilities, from the life I'd provided. But Patricia, your mother, she saw it differently. She told me you were running toward yourself, toward becoming the person you were meant to be without my constant criticism weighing you down. She was right, as she usually was about matters of the heart. My father described the years after I left, how the house felt emptier, how he'd catch himself looking for me at family dinners before remembering I was gone. He detailed my mother's decline, the stroke and the slow deterioration that followed. I blamed myself for not being there when she needed me. I blamed you for the same thing, which wasn't fair since you came back and gave her 3 years I couldn't be bothered to give. Derek visited on Sundays like clockwork, but you were there every day, sacrificing your own life to care for her. The words that came next stopped me cold. I knew what I did at Patricia's funeral was unforgivable. I saw your face when I blamed you for her stroke, for her death. I saw you break, and I felt powerful in that moment, which makes me a monster. When you left without saying goodbye, I told myself good riddance. But the truth was, I'd driven away the only person who'd loved Patricia the way she deserved to be loved. He explained the trust's creation. I started setting money aside for you the month after you left. Called it insurance at first, told myself it was just prudent financial planning. But I knew what it really was. Guilt. Regret. A coward's way of apologizing because I couldn't do it to your face. Every quarter, I transferred more funds. Every year, I bought another property and added it to the trust. It became a ritual, my way of acknowledging what I couldn't say out loud, that you were worth everything I'd told you you weren't. The letter detailed the assets. 2 apartment buildings in Northwest Portland generating steady rental income. A commercial property leased to a tech startup. Stock portfolios in blue-chip companies and emerging technologies. Bonds and cash reserves. It's not enough to compensate for what I took from you, all those years of making you feel inadequate. But it's what I have to give. Near the end, the handwriting grew shakier. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to remember me fondly because there's nothing fond to remember. What I'm asking is that you use these resources to build the life you want, free from financial worry, free from anyone's judgment. Be the artist, the writer, the sensitive soul I tried to crush. Prove that I was wrong about everything. The final paragraph broke me completely. You were never the failure, Elena. I was. And if there's any justice in whatever comes after this life, I'll spend eternity knowing what I lost by being too broken to love you the way you deserved. Your mother saw who you really were. I hope someday you'll forgive yourself for believing my lies about your worth. Signed, Gerald Vance. I sat in that borrowed office and sobbed. Not gentle tears but wrenching, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded. All the years of criticism, of feeling inadequate, of internalizing my father's contempt, and here was proof that he'd known all along. He'd known he was destroying me, and he'd done it anyway. The money, the trust, all of it was an admission of guilt, a monument to his own failure as a father. Eventually, the tears subsided. I washed my face in the small bathroom attached to the office, staring at my red eyes and blotchy cheeks in the mirror. This was what closure looked like, messy and painful and complicated. I returned to the conference room where Malcolm, Derek, and Brittany waited in tense silence. Derek studied my face, the evidence of tears obvious. What did it say? I folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. That he knew what he was doing to me. That he was sorry in his own broken way. I looked at Malcolm. I want to see everything. All the trust documents, the properties, the investments. I need to understand exactly what this means. Over the next 2 hours, Malcolm walked me through the intricate structure my father had created. The Cascade Trust, named after the mountain range visible from his office, contained assets acquired over 15 years. Each purchase, each transfer, had been documented with meticulous care. The properties alone were worth over $3 million. The stocks and bonds brought the total to $4.2 million, just as Malcolm had said. Derek remained silent through most of the explanation, his expression shifting between anger and something that looked almost like hurt. When Malcolm finished, I turned to my brother. Did you know about any of this? He shook his head. Dad and I talked about succession planning, about the business transition. He showed me the will 6 months ago when his health started declining. Said everything would be mine because I'd earned it. Never mentioned a trust. Never mentioned he'd been setting aside millions for you. Brittany cleared her throat delicately. What are you going to do? It was the question I'd been asking myself. $4.2 million. More money than I'd earned in several lifetimes working at the coffee shop. Money that could eliminate financial worry forever, fund any creative project I wanted to pursue, allow me to help others the way Harper had helped me. Money that represented my father's guilt and regret. I need time to think, I said finally. This is overwhelming. Malcolm nodded. Understandable. The trust provisions give you complete control over distribution timing. You can access the funds immediately, or you can leave them invested. There's no pressure to make immediate decisions. Derek stood, clearly eager to leave. I have a company to run. Whatever you decide, Elena, just know that Dad built Vance Industrial for me. That was always the plan. I recognized the defensive posture, the need to assert his position. I know, Derek. I never wanted the business. That was always yours. After Derek and Brittany left, I remained in the conference room with Malcolm. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. Can I ask you something? I said. Did he seem different when he set this up? My father? Malcolm considered the question. He was methodical, focused. But there was something else. Regret, maybe. He asked me once if I thought it was possible to undo damage done to a child. I told him that depended on the damage and the effort put into repairing it. What did he say? Malcolm's smile was sad. He said some damage was too deep for repair, but maybe you could at least pay the medical bills. It was such a perfectly Gerald Vance response, pragmatic and emotionally stunted even in acknowledgement of harm done. I left Malcolm's office as the city settled into evening rush hour, streetlights flickering on against the growing darkness. I drove through Portland's rain-slicked streets, not heading home but aimlessly navigating neighborhoods I'd known all my life. I passed the West Hills house where I'd grown up, now Derek's inheritance. Lights blazed from the windows, Brittany probably already redecorating. I drove past Reed College, where I discovered literature and poetry and the possibility of life beyond my father's narrow expectations. Eventually, I found myself at Roasters Republic. The coffee shop was busy with the evening crowd, students hunched over laptops, couples sharing desserts, the comfortable chaos of a neighborhood gathering place. Harper was there, sitting at her usual corner table with a stack of manuscripts. She looked up as I entered, her expression shifting to concern when she saw my face. "Come here," she said simply, pulling out the chair beside her. I collapsed into it, suddenly exhausted. Malcolm gave me a letter from my father. And $4.2 million. Harper's eyebrows rose. That's quite a letter. I told her everything, the trust, the properties, the detailed confession of parental failure. Harper listened without interrupting, her hand occasionally touching mine in silent support. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you feeling?" she asked finally. "Angry. Sad. Confused. Validated, weirdly." I tried to articulate the complicated tangle of emotions. All those years, I thought maybe I was too sensitive, that I was making too big a deal of his criticism. But this letter proves he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was hurting me, and he did it anyway. Harper nodded. "And now he's trying to buy forgiveness from the grave." "That's what it feels like," I admitted. "Like he thinks $4 million can erase 34 years of emotional abuse." But even as I said it, I knew it was more complicated. The money wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. It was my father's broken way of saying he'd been wrong about me. Over the next few days, I moved through my life in a daze. I continued working at the coffee shop, pulling espresso shots and steaming milk while processing the seismic shift in my circumstances. I didn't tell my coworkers about the inheritance. Somehow, speaking it aloud would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Harper helped me research financial advisors, people who specialized in sudden wealth management. "This is life-changing money," she cautioned. "You need professional guidance to handle it wisely." I met with 3 different advisors before finding Jordan Martinez, a certified financial planner who worked primarily with women who'd come into unexpected wealth through inheritance or divorce. Jordan was methodical and patient, explaining investment strategies and tax implications without condescension. "The first rule," she told me in our initial meeting, "is that you don't have to decide everything immediately. Take time to adjust to this new reality." A week after the funeral, Derek called. We hadn't spoken since the meeting in Malcolm's office. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice stiff. "In person?" We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in the Pearl District that neither of us frequented. Derek looked tired, older somehow. The confidence he'd displayed at the funeral had eroded, revealing someone less certain underneath. "I'd been going through Dad's files at the house," he began without preamble. "Found correspondence between him and Malcolm dating back 15 years. Found notes about the trust, about you." He pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "Thought you should have these." The folder contained printouts of emails, handwritten notes, even a draft of the letter my father had eventually sent to me. I scanned them, seeing my name appear again and again. Mentions of quarterly transfers, property acquisitions made for Elena's trust, notes about investment strategies to maximize long-term growth. My father had been building this financial foundation for me with the same meticulous attention he'd applied to building his business. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked Derek. He stared into his coffee cup. "Because I spent my entire life trying to earn his approval. Did everything he asked, became who he wanted me to be. And it turns out he was spending all that time building something for you, the daughter he claimed was a disappointment." The pain in his voice was genuine. I recognized it because I'd felt variations of it my entire life. "Derek, he left you the business. The house. That was his legacy." Derek laughed bitterly. "Yeah, the business I've been working at for 15 years, the legacy I earned. You got the money he set aside because he felt guilty about how he treated you. Do you know how that feels? To realize your father's guilt was worth more than your dedication? I hadn't considered Derek's perspective, how the revelation of the trust would affect him. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. I didn't ask for this. He looked up, his eyes searching my face. Are you going to take it? The money? It was the same question everyone kept asking. I don't know yet. It feels like accepting payment for my own abuse. Derek was quiet for a moment. He was hard on me too, you know. Different than with you, but still hard. Nothing was ever good enough. Every success was expected, every failure was catastrophic. He ran his hand through his hair. I used to envy you for leaving. You escaped and built your own life. I stayed and became an extension of him. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. What would you do? I asked. If you were me? Derek considered. Take the money. Use it for something he'd hate. Write your books, fund artists, support causes he'd despise. Turn his guilt into something good. That would be better revenge than refusing it. After Derek left, I sat alone with my coffee and the folder of documents he'd given me. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting, dated 3 years earlier. Elena turns 30 today. I didn't call. Haven't spoken to her in 4 years. Don't even know where she's living. Patricia would be ashamed of me. Transferred additional $50,000 to the trust. It changes nothing, but it's all I can do. My 30th birthday. I'd spent it at a writer's workshop in Seattle, surrounded by new friends, celebrating over Thai food and cheap wine. I hadn't thought about my father that day, hadn't mourned his absence. I'd been too busy building the life he'd always dismissed. And all the while, he'd been acknowledging my existence the only way he knew how, through financial transactions that kept me connected to him even in estrangement. That evening, I called Malcolm. I want to accept the trust, I told him. But I want to do something specific with part of it. Over the next hour, I outlined my plan. $1 million would go into conservative investments managed by Jordan, creating long-term financial security. Another $1 million would establish the Patricia Vance Foundation for Creative Arts, providing grants and support for emerging writers, artists, and musicians. The remaining funds would purchase a small building in southeast Portland to create affordable studio spaces for artists. You're keeping less than a quarter of it for yourself, Malcolm observed. That's generous. It wasn't generosity. It was alchemy, transforming my father's guilt into something my mother would have valued. My father had built an empire through ruthless ambition. I would build a legacy through creative support and community. The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. During that time, I gave notice at Roasters Republic, thanking my manager for 6 years of stability and community. I told my coworkers I'd received an inheritance, enough to pursue writing full-time. They threw me a going-away party, crowding into the small back room with homemade desserts and heartfelt cards. Harper stood beside me through it all, proud and a little teary. Your mother would be so proud, she whispered during the toasts. Derek and I began meeting for coffee every few weeks, tentatively rebuilding a sibling relationship that had been poisoned by our father's manipulation. We talked about our childhoods, comparing notes on the different ways Gerald had damaged us. Derek was seeing a therapist, working through his own complicated grief and identity crisis. Turns out I don't know who I am outside of being Dad's heir, he admitted during one meeting. Kind of terrifying to figure it out at 42. The day the Patricia Vance Foundation officially launched, I stood in the small office space I'd rented in a converted warehouse, surrounded by the paperwork and files that represented my mother's true legacy. Harper had agreed to serve on the board of directors, along with 2 other local writers I respected. Our first year's grant recipients had just been announced, 12 artists receiving funding to pursue projects they'd thought impossible. Among the recipients was a young Vietnamese writer creating a memoir about her immigrant family's experience in Portland. Reading her application, I'd seen echoes of my own journey, finding identity between cultures, negotiating between family expectation and personal truth. The grant would give her a year to write without financial pressure, the kind of freedom I'd never had but could now provide to others. I thought about my father often during those first months. Not with the old anger or pain, but with a complicated understanding. He'd been broken by his own childhood, shaped by poverty and abuse into someone who could only express love through control and provision. He'd destroyed our relationship but tried to build something else in its place, something that would outlast him. It wasn't redemption. But it was acknowledgement. On what would have been my father's 68th birthday, I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple granite, his name and dates and the inscription Derek had chosen. Builder. Leader. Father. I stood there holding flowers, purple irises like the ones I'd brought to my mother's grave. "I'm using your money to do everything you thought was worthless," I said aloud to the stone. "Supporting artists, funding creative work, helping people be soft in a hard world. Mom would love it. I think maybe part of you would too, the part you spent your whole life trying to kill." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain. I placed the flowers on the grave and turned to leave, feeling lighter than I had in months. My father's final gift hadn't been the money. It had been the truth, the admission that I'd been right all along. I wasn't the failure. He was. And in that truth, I'd finally found freedom. 6 months after the foundation launched, I received an unexpected phone call from Derek. His voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Can you come to the house? There's something you need to see." I drove to the West Hills residence on a crisp spring morning, cherry blossoms drifting across the manicured lawn. Derek met me at the door, leading me directly to our father's old study. The room had remained largely untouched since Gerald's death, a shrine to the man who had dominated both our lives. "I was finally going through his desk," Derek explained, gesturing to the massive mahogany piece that had always seemed more throne than furniture. "Found a false bottom in one of the drawers." He handed me a worn leather journal, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully. The entries dated back 30 years, written in my father's younger, steadier hand. They chronicled his thoughts, fears, and observations about parenthood. I found the entry from my birth date and began reading. "Patricia brought home our second daughter today. Elena. She's perfect and tiny and I'm already terrified I'll ruin her the way my father ruined me." The journal revealed a Gerald Vance I'd never known, a man aware of his own damage, fighting against patterns he feared were inevitable. I find myself criticizing Elena for the same sensitivity Patricia loves in her. I hear my father's voice coming out of my mouth and I hate it, but I don't know how to stop. Entry after entry documented his internal struggle. When I won the writing competition at 13, he'd written, "Elena won statewide recognition today." I barely acknowledged it. Told her writing doesn't pay bills. The truth is her talent terrifies me. She's better at 13 than I'll ever be at anything that matters. How do I tell her I'm proud when I've spent years convincing her she's not enough? Tears blurred my vision as I read about my time in Vietnam. Elena left for Asia today. Patricia cried all morning. I told her it was good riddance, that Elena was running from responsibility. But I went to her empty room tonight and sat on her bed and felt the absence like a physical wound. I've driven away my own daughter and I don't know how to fix it. The entries during my mother's illness were particularly painful. Patricia is dying and Elena came home to care for her. She's here every day, patient and loving, everything I'm not. I stay away because watching them together shows me exactly what I've destroyed. Derek visits on schedule like a business obligation. Elena loves without conditions. I don't deserve either of them. The final entries were written after my mother's funeral, after I'd left for the final time. I destroyed Elena today. Said unforgivable things in front of everyone. Blamed her for Patricia's death when the only person to blame is myself. She left without a word. I watched her pack from the hallway, wanted to stop her, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. They never do. So I'll do what I know how to do. I'll set aside money. I'll build her a future even if I've destroyed her past. Derek watched me read, his own eyes red. There are dozens of entries about both of us. About how he wanted to be different but didn't know how. About the trust he created for you, the business he built for me. About hating himself for being incapable of just telling us he loved us. I closed the journal carefully, my hands trembling. This was the missing piece, the evidence that my father's cruelty hadn't been indifference but a desperate, twisted battle against his own demons. It didn't excuse anything he'd done. But it completed the picture. What do we do with this? I asked Derek. He shrugged. I thought maybe we could read it together sometime. Understand him better, understand ourselves better. We're both still figuring out who we are outside of being his damaged children. Over the following weeks, Derek and I met regularly to go through our father's journal. We discovered entries about Derek's football injuries that he'd played through to avoid disappointing Gerald, about business decisions our father had made specifically to create opportunities for Derek's growth, about pride he'd felt watching Derek present at industry conferences but never expressed. We found entries about our mother, Gerald's awareness of her unhappiness, his inability to change the patterns that caused it. Patricia deserves so much better than me, he'd written a year before her stroke. She stays out of some misguided loyalty to vows she made when she was young and hopeful. I've killed that hope slowly, year by year, and I don't know how to revive it. The journal became a strange kind of therapy for both Derek and me. We began comparing our memories, filling in gaps in each other's understanding. Derek told me about the enormous pressure he'd felt to be perfect, how every success had felt hollow because it was expected rather than celebrated. I told him about the years of feeling invisible, of believing I was fundamentally flawed. We were both manipulated, Derek said during one of our sessions. Just in different ways. He made you feel worthless while making me feel like my worth depended entirely on his approval. Different prisons, same jailer. Through this process, Derek and I rebuilt something neither of us had known we'd lost. A sibling relationship based on honesty and mutual support rather than competition for parental approval. We started having dinner together weekly, sometimes with Brittany and Harper joining us, creating the family we'd needed as children. The Patricia Vance Foundation flourished beyond my expectations. By the end of the first year, we'd supported 40 artists, writers, and musicians. Several grant recipients had gone on to publish books, mount exhibitions, and release albums. The affordable studio spaces I'd purchased were constantly full, a creative community emerging from my father's guilt money. I wrote every day, no longer at coffee shop tables between shifts but in a dedicated home office in the small house I'd purchased in Southeast Portland. My first book, a memoir about family trauma and financial reconciliation, found a publisher. The advance was modest, but the validation was immeasurable. I was doing exactly what my father had dismissed as worthless, and I was succeeding. On the anniversary of Gerald's death, Derek and I visited the cemetery together. We brought flowers for both our parents, standing between the two graves that bookend our complicated childhood. Do you think he'd be proud? Derek asked. Of what we've become? I considered the question. I think he'd be confused. We're succeeding in ways he didn't understand. But yeah, maybe proud too. In his broken way. Derek nodded. The foundation, the book, the community you've built, that's real legacy. More than the business he left me. The business is real too, I countered. You've expanded it, made it more ethical, changed the culture. That's your legacy, not his. We stood in comfortable silence, two survivors of the same war, finally at peace. As we walked back to our cars, Derek stopped suddenly. I've been thinking about selling the house. Too many ghosts. But there's something I want you to have first. A week later, he delivered a box to my door. Inside were photo albums I'd never seen, pictures of our mother with Derek and me as children, her smile genuine and bright. There were letters she'd written but never sent, drafts of things she'd wanted to say to both of us. Among them was a letter addressed to me, dated 2 weeks before her stroke. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I want you to know that you were never the failure your father claimed. You were always my greatest success, proof that love and creativity and gentleness can survive even in hostile environments. Whatever he's told you about your worth, disbelieve it. You are valuable beyond measure. My mother had known. She'd tried to tell me, but I'd been too deep in my father's narrative to hear her. Now, years later, her words finally landed. I wasn't redeemed by my father's guilty money or his posthumous confession. I was valuable because I'd always been valuable, because my mother had seen it and I'd finally learned to see it myself. I framed my mother's letter and hung it in my office, above my desk where I wrote daily. On difficult days when doubt crept in, when my father's old criticisms echoed in my mind, I would read her words and remember. The foundation bearing her name, the community of artists I supported, the books I was writing, none of it was about proving my father wrong. It was about honoring my mother's vision of who I could become. The trust my father created hadn't bought forgiveness. But it had bought freedom, the freedom to build a life entirely on my own terms, to transform inherited pain into purposeful creation. In the end, that was the only revenge that mattered, living well, loving freely, and proving that the sensitive, creative, empathetic person my father had tried to destroy was exactly who the world needed me to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.